Welcome to Restoring Hope, the podcast of the Missionaries of the Precious Blood, where we reflect on God's love poured out for a wounded world. I'm your host, Patrick Higgins, and today we're blessed to welcome Father Joseph Nassal for an encore appearance. Father Nassal's homilies always meet us right where we are, inviting us to listen more deeply for God's voice in the messiness of everyday life. Whether you've heard Father Nassal before or you're encountering his ministry for the first time, you're in for a word that's honest, hope-filled, and rooted in the saving power of Christ's precious blood. So settle in, open your heart, and let the Spirit speak as Father Nassal shares his homily with us. Father Nassal, thanks for being with us again.
Thank you, Patrick. Good to be with you. Many years ago, I was driving from Missouri to California, and along the way, I passed through a town called Hope, Arizona. There wasn't much in the town, maybe a bar or two or a storefront. But I remember the people of Hope had a very great sense of humor because a few miles out of town, there was a sign that said, "You are now beyond hope." This episode of the Restoring Hope podcast, I want to really focus on how we are never beyond hope. How do we keep hope alive in a chaotic world? Pope Francis had declared in 2025 a Jubilee year and called us pilgrims of hope. Well, drawing from the inspiration of St. Paul's letter to the Romans, Pope Francis said that Christian hope does not deceive or disappoint because it's grounded in the certainty that nothing or no one may ever separate us from the love of God. Hope is born when we realize God is always with us and that God always keeps the divine promises. Too often, I think we confuse hope with optimism. Many years ago, I remember hearing William Sloane Coffin say that hope is born when optimism dies. And Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe really affirms this. He said, hope is not optimism, but it's the confidence that we live with all the confusion and pain. We will somehow have a future and all will have meaning because God is in the midst of it. It really echoes another famous quote about hope. In fact, one of my favorite quotes about hope is from the Czech poet and former president, the first president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel. He called hope an orientation of the spirit. It's not the conviction that something is going to turn out the way I want or the way it will all turn out well. Hope is about how everything makes sense regardless of how it turns out. It makes sense because God is in the midst of it. That's what I mean by putting a faith-based spin on hope. It's not that things are going to turn out the way I want them to, or how I would imagine or like them to turn out. God is there to help us always find meaningness in the messiness of life. Thomas Merton Hope once said that hope doesn't mean an anticipation or expectation of deliverance from an intolerable situation or an oppressive situation. That's what most of us think hope is. It's that, oh, if I only get past this terrible time in my life. True hope, he said, is trusting that wherever we are and who we are is more than enough because we're children of God. And as children of God, God will never leave us. God is always with us. When we're going through a challenging time, we often view hope as something that lies at the end of the rainbow, when the storms have passed. But what I want to affirm today is hope is what gets us through those storms of life. Hope is what gets us out of bed in the morning and motivates us to live in such a way that we bring our world a little closer to the vision of God's realm of justice and peace and truth and love, as lived by Jesus. You know, they often say love makes the world go round and faith allows us to trust that all things are possible. But hope is the starting point for all ministry and mission activity. Pope Francis wrote that we must nurture hope today and must nurture hope for tomorrow by healing today's pain. And we heal today's pain by inviting Jesus into the little tombs of our hearts, inviting Jesus into our wounds, our regrets, our resentments. Jesus showed us how to do that, how to nurture hope at the Last Supper when he was celebrated the Passover with his friends. This is such an important part of our spirituality, the precious blood, that even though one would betray him and another would deny him and the rest would leave him like thieves in the night, Jesus offers his very self, his body and blood, as a sign of hope for the future. This is my body, this is my blood, given for you. Whenever you do this, remember me. That amid the fear and the greed and the deceit and the betrayal, he offered communion. That's the basis of our hope. As Cardinal Timothy Radcliffe said, the Last Supper, there didn't seem to be any future. All that lay ahead was failure or suffering or death. And yet in this darkest moment, Jesus made the most hopeful gesture in the history of the world. This is my body given for you. This is my blood to be poured out for you. This is what it means to hope beyond hope. This is what it means to remember that we're never beyond hope. It is the hope that is nurtured in relationships, in small gestures and acts of human kindness amid the most trying and terrifying times. One of my favorite singers is Mary Chapin Carpenter, and she had a podcast a few years ago called Hope is a Muscle. And one of the episodes, she interviewed Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin, who had written a very powerful memoir about the death of his son Tommy, who died by suicide December 31st, 2020. A week after Tommy's death, Raskin, as a member of Congress, was at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021, to certify the election when an angry mob stormed the building. And in that podcast, Raskin addresses the difference between optimism and hope. He said something to the effect that optimism is almost like a personality trait, that some people are more optimistic and some people are more pessimistic, that it's almost something we're born with, that it's just the mysteries and miracles of heredity and genetics. But hope, he said, is something anybody can choose, because hope is a decision. It's like telling yourself to exercise. I'm going to exercise today. Well, that's what hope is. It's about saying, I'm going to hope today, no matter what the world looks like. We must exercise hope. We must practice hope, or else it will die. Krista Tippett calls it a renewable resource that helps us move through life. It's not who we wish to be, it's who we are. And the more we practice hope, she said, the more we form a spiritual muscle memory that allows us to orientate our life, to view the world not through rose-colored glasses of optimism, but rather through the realistic vision that comes from deep within. We practice hope in very simple ways, day to day, and yet very sacred ways. For example, several years ago, Mary Chapin Carpenter suffered a pulmonary embolism as she finished a concert, and she acknowledged how lucky she was to survive, since many people don't survive that kind of embolism. But during her recovery, she said, she became very depressed, anxious, self-loathing, the ingredients of darkness that defines depression. She tried to see this unexpected time as a gift, but she'd open a novel and couldn't concentrate. And she said, familiar clouds would gather above my head, and I couldn't make them go away no matter what. I couldn't make them go away with a pill or a movie or a walk. She said the time of recovery was becoming a curse. It was filling her with fear. And so she didn't know what to do. Well, one day she goes to the grocery store and she said, sometimes it's the smile of a stranger that helps. Sometimes it's a phone call from a long absent friend checking on how you're doing. She found her lifeline at the grocery store that day. That morning, this young man who rang up her groceries simply looked at her and asked if she wanted paper or plastic. And then when he had finished packing her groceries, he said, I hope you enjoy your day. And it wasn't a throwaway line, she said. He looked her in the eyes and said, I hope you enjoy your day. I looked at him, she said, and I knew he meant it. It stopped her in her tracks. And she said she went out into her car and just began to cry. Because what I want more than anything, she said, is to appreciate I have this day and I have tomorrow and hopefully days beyond that. What she experienced that day was what she called the learning curve of gratitude. That to just be grateful for this moment that we draw breath, It's that simple wish of a young man to enjoy her day. That was the moment of recognition that gave Mary Chapin Carpenter hope. I don't want to say, have a nice day, like a robot. I don't want to get mad at the elderly driver in front of me. I don't want to go crazy when my internet access is messed up. I don't want to be jealous of someone else's success. She said, I just want to be grateful for what I have right now, for the people in my life, and for the love I have. That young man in the grocery store reminded me that every day is all there is. And so with a renewed sense of hope, she went home that night. She made dinner with the groceries she bought. She told her husband how much she loved him. She curled up with her dogs and watched the sunset over the mountains, climbed into bed, turned out the lights, and was grateful for another day. You see, my friends, during the Jubilee year of hope, Pope Francis really called us to be tangible signs of hope for our brothers and sisters who experience hardship of any kind. And he offered several practical ways in which we can be people of hope, pilgrims of hope to people in need, like caring for the sick at home or in the hospital, or to remind them the closeness of our affection, to care for the elderly who are often lonely and abandoned. But he also emphasized how we must be signs of hope for young people. The Holy Father said, it's sad to see so many young people today who are without hope because they lack employment or job security or prospects for the future, and they grow discouraged. When confronting all the issues that can lead many in our world today to be discouraged and to despair about the present or the future, we must acknowledge that we're powerless to prevent loss. But we can decide, we can choose how to respond to the losses that pile up in our lives. The great Russian novelist Dostoevsky said, those who hope live, those who don't die. And there was no better example of that than in the death camps of Auschwitz and in Nazi Germany. Viktor Frankl, in his famous book, Man's Search for Meaning, recounts an experience in the Nazi concentration camp and talks about how the prisoners who exercised the power to choose to hope, how they would respond to the circumstances displayed, the people who displayed courage and dignity and inner vitality in the midst of this absolute evil. He said they were the ones to transcend the suffering. They were the ones, Frankl wrote, who survived because they refused to yield to the power of victimhood. They refused to yield power to their captors and their circumstances. Though they were victims of one of the most horrific examples of inhumanity in history and seemingly powerless against the oppressors, being powerless does not mean we give up hope. Rather, when we face those situations, we choose to draw on our inner resources and we choose to live with hope rather than die in despair. Frankl's book is so powerful and remains one of the great testimonies of the human spirit because he talks about how human beings, as children of God, we can draw upon that inner strength, that inner courage, that inner resilience to survive even the most horrific evil and find meaning in life. One of the stories Frankl tells is the day he arrived in Auschwitz, the day he was arrested, and how he tried to hide the manuscript that he'd been working on all of his life. This was his life's work. But when he gets to Auschwitz, they strip him of everything. He's standing naked in the cold camp, bitter cold, and they take everything away from him, including that manuscript that he'd been working on all of his life. So standing naked there and shivering in the cold, Frankl was given worn-out rags of an inmate who had been sent to the gas chamber immediately after he had arrived. And in the pocket of this newly acquired coat, he found a single page torn from the Hebrew prayer book containing the most important prayer in the Jewish faith. This is the prayer. Hear, O Israel, Lord our God. The Lord our God is God alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. Viktor Frankl carried that prayer with him throughout his incarceration at Auschwitz. It gave him courage. It gave him hope to suffer bravely, to know that when one refuses to allow evil to infiltrate one's heart, life has meaning, even into the last moment, and it retains that meaning to the very end. You know, some people think hope is often used to refer to something mystical or rhetorical, but I always like how Jim Wallace said that hope, doesn't lie somewhere outside our reality. When we do that, hope becomes a feeling or a mood that may inspire us in a moment, but then leave us. And that we can't do anything about the dull and painful agonies of history. But hope is not out there somewhere, outside our experience or out of reach. Hope is something deep within us. It's covered up perhaps at times by the dirt and dust of shattered dreams, the remnants of broken relationships, the sharp edges of grief or guilt. From a biblical perspective, though, hope is the very dynamic of history. Hope, Wallace said, is the engine of change. It's the energy of transformation. In effect, hope is the gate of how we get from one reality to the next. That's why this podcast, Restoring Hope, is all about how we maintain hope in the midst of difficult and dangerous situations, because this is what we need today. We need radical, audacious hope. It's the kind of hope that I tell often in retreats about, again, in Jim Wallace's book, The Soul of Politics, he tells this powerful story about Desmond Tutu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. In the midst of the apartheid, the government had denied any gatherings of people who were protesting or against apartheid. And so they issued this warning, there would be no public gatherings. But somehow all the people who were against apartheid would come out of their homes and they gathered into St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town, South Africa. And Desmond Tutu, the late Desmond Tutu, one of the greatest people of hope the world has ever known, stood at that pulpit as people streamed out of their homes, filled the cathedral, spilled out into the square. The military forces could not deal with all the people amassed that day around the cathedral. And as Archbishop Tutu stood in that pulpit, he said, "In the enveloping darkness, as the lights of freedom are extinguished one by one, despite all the evidence to the contrary, we have come here," he said, "to say that evil and injustice and oppression and exploitation embodied in the very nature of apartheid cannot prevail. When all looks hopeless," he said, "we must assert confidently that it is God who is in charge." And then directing his fiery temper toward the white rulers, again, naming the hope, he said, "You're not God. You're mortals. It's God who we worship, and God will not be mocked. Look at all these people," he said. "Don't you realize you've already lost? Come and join the winning side." My friends, that's the quality of hope we need to tap today. To tap the very best in us, which is our truest self. It's the hope that reflects our belief that once the forces of goodness are unleashed against evil and oppression, like so many lights in the gathering gloom, the darkness will be overwhelmed. A Native American teacher, Episcopal Bishop Stephen Charleston, wrote a book a couple years ago that I found very helpful. The book was called A Ladder to the Light. And it focuses on how hope is essential if we're to get through the most difficult times in our lives. Well, Bishop Charleston is a member of the Choctaw Nation, and the world came to an end for his people in 1831. It was that year that the Choctaw people were forced from their ancestral homeland and made to walk on a death march. It's now known as the Trail of Tears. Bishop Charleston said thousands and thousands of people died during that march. We lost our homes, he said. We lost our way of life, even our graveyards. We lost everything. And even though the world, he said, was engulfed in darkness, what kept the people climbing to the light was hope. That trail of tears wraps around the world today, through cities and towns, universities and homeless shelters, through Uvalde, Texas, and Kiev, Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, Minneapolis, St. Paul, so many other places where parents mourn the loss of children, where children are abandoned because their parents have been kidnapped or killed. One looks around the landscape of the world today, and you can understand why people are losing hope, why people feel hopeless. But you see, we don't find hope out there somewhere. It's in here. Sometimes, as I said, it's buried so deep we can't seem to find it, or we think we've lost it. But you see, hope is always within us. It's in our DNA until we die. We're born with it. We embody it. And when it is awakened, it has the power to change the world. Bishop Charleston calls hope a tool to create light, a spark that suddenly illuminates the gloom that creeps into our lives. It can be dormant for a long time, hidden beneath blankets of despair that we think are going to protect us because we're afraid. But hope is the energy that allows us to throw off those blankets. And rather than sleep through wars and insurrections and deportations and genocides, to instead get out of bed and begin another day to work for justice, for peace, for equality, for truth, for love in all the relationships of our daily life. Hope is the catalyst. It's the tipping point where we believe and become what we do. In reflecting on how his ancestors survived that terrible evil of the Trail of Tears, he said, we experienced the whole tribe of human beings who had experienced at one time or another throughout history the struggle of life, the pain of oppression, and the fear of the unknown. But their long walk with one another allowed them to nurture courage and hope in one another. And they walked with courage and dignity because of that hope of the Spirit within them. My friends, hope gives us the courage, the energy to continue the journey, though it may be easier to give up or give in. The people who saw, the people saw they were not walking alone. They had God with them. They nurtured that hope with them. And our challenge is not only to have hope, but to embody hope. In conclusion, we often hear people say, in a difficult or dangerous or fearful situation, let's hope for the best. And it sounds like wishful thinking. They really don't believe that what they hope for will come true. But they say it to keep that small belief that how they want everything to turn out alive in their hearts. But my friends, hope is not a wish. It's an intention. It's a choice. Hope arises when we embrace the sacred reality. The vision is not a dream. It's a goal. When we project into our future through faith, it's not just wishful thinking. We're not dreamers out of touch with reality. It's actually the blueprint of our future and allows us to see clearly what's before us. We have profound examples in Scripture. Mary saying yes to something she didn't understand to be the mother of Jesus. Joseph thinking Mary had betrayed him because he knew he wasn't the father of the child, and yet trusting in his dream to protect Mary and the child Jesus. The first followers of Jesus after the resurrection and his ascension into heaven, they gathered together. They were open to that Holy Spirit burning within their hearts. Pope Francis said just before he died, all it takes to restore hope is one good person. Too many people today are losing hope because they've resigned themselves to the way things are and have become accustomed to the dark. This is dangerous because when we lose hope, we die. But when we make hope the guiding energy of our lives, we transition, Pope Francis said, from being scattered individuals who wish things would be better to active partners of the Holy Spirit, reshaping the balance of life toward mercy, justice, and peace. All it takes, my friends, to restore hope is one good person. May each of us be that good person. Thank you for listening. Take good care.
Father Nassal, thank you for sharing a powerful reflection with us and for preaching a word that reminds us that we're never, beyond God's mercy or love, or the healing and reconciliation power of the precious blood as it continues to inspire all of us who are trying to follow Christ more faithfully in our own lives. To our listeners, thanks for spending time with us and for allowing God's word to meet you wherever you are today. If Father Nassal's homily stirred anything in your heart, we invite you to share it, reflect on it, and pass it along to someone who might need a little extra hope. Learn more about Missionaries of the Precious Blood at preciousbloodus.org and on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Until next time, may the peace of Christ and the love of the precious blood go with you always.